I love video games, and I especially love it when video games try to branch out into different types of media, like League of Legends when they wanted to do the Arcane series, or the multitude of gacha games that tried to dip their toes into doing an anime. I mean, hell, even Dota 2 got an animated series, which I actually look back on really fondly, no matter what Reddit says. And because I myself don't want to commit to over 100 hours of gameplay just to make the 50th video on YouTube about how Nier is a masterpiece, even though it probably is, I decided to instead make a video covering the good and the not so great of the 3 different manga created for the Nier extended universe, that being Songstress 5, Fatal Crimson, and Yorha Pearl Harbor Descent Mission Record. Going forward, I will be referring to the twins as 1 and Brother 1, so just know that if I'm saying Brother 1, I'm referring to the male twin. Each manga boils down to following its respective character throughout a mission. 1 is trying to get stronger so they can save the world and kill Zero. Brother 1 is trying to eradicate the red eye infection, and A2 is completing a mission assigned to them by command in their fight against the machine lifeforms. Songstress 5 and Fatal Crimson are by far the most confusing to read, but that's mostly because outside lore knowledge does a lot of the heavy lifting in order for some scenes to make sense. For example, Songstress 5 never explains how the sisters were born, or why they want to kill Zero, and Fatal Crimson never explains how despite Brother 1 being twins with 1, we never see him palling around with the other 5 sisters. We never even hear about him mentioned in the other manga. Which is fine, I'm sure these stories were made for a different target audience. For people who already are familiar with the story, it just would have been nice if the writers hadn't relied so much on the reader's pre-established lore knowledge for the story to make sense. Harbor Descent, on the other hand, has you feeling like you know as much as the androids about the world and the mission, and if you're confused about something, chances are the androids are too. Main characters. Starting with Songstress 5, the story follows 1 who is shown to be driven by a strong sense of justice. When 1 and her sisters are storming a castle, they actively spare the random guards, as they are kind of just there doing their job. She even calls out that the monsters chasing them were once human, so instead of killing them, the group just runs away. She is definitely someone who is more interested in pulling out the root of the evil, rather than just killing everyone who might be a part of it. Much like 1, Brother 1 is also someone who wants to save the world. However, he is less motivated by a strong sense of justice, and more motivated by wanting to protect the world that loved 1 so much, even if it means completely losing himself and whatever humanity he has in him. Brother 1's story is definitely a lot more tragic, and I'd say it's probably fair to label it as edgy. However, I don't agree that Brother 1's story is over the top. If there's any shocking scenes throughout his entire story, they usually serve a purpose to his character or the world they live in, and I think to label it as edgy is a little dismissive. I think if they wanted to make things shocking for the sake of shocking, they could have gone a lot harder on it, and they didn't, and I think that says a lot. Moving on from Drakengard, A2 was a character that I really did not like at the start. I thought she was really average, and that to me just felt like it made for a boring character. I'm gonna be honest, I thought she was kind of boring. But as the story went on, she started to grow on me. She started to develop as a leader, she started to develop as a character, and I thought that was really cool. I mean, yes, it probably tends to happen when you watch all your friends die so that you can continue a bogus mission, but A2 actually developed as a character. I really don't like how 1 just feels like she remained the same character that she was at the start of the story all the way to the end. Doesn't really feel like she changed a lot. It feels like she didn't really grow, which is a shame because out of these 3 characters, 1 feels like the only one that didn't really get a proper story. Her manga felt like a set of events stitched together to make a story that really leaves you with more questions than answers about each of the characters shown. I would probably attribute this to the manga only being 16 chapters and having 3 different groups of characters doing 3 different things in different parts of the world, so maybe if they had more time they could have fleshed out these storylines more, but I guess we'll never know. I won't get too deep into each side character in Harbor Descent, but all you need to know is that there are 2 factions of supporting characters. You have the ones aligned with Yorha, who are Commander White, Futaba, Yatsuba, Number 4, Number 16, Number 21. Then you have the Resistance faction, which includes Rose, Daisy, Lily, Dahlia, Anemone, Gerbera, and Margaret. And I really like how they actually took time to talk about each of the supporting characters, their motives, their personalities, and they even had cute little interactions, and it was nice, and it's actually really impressive considering I think Harbor Descent had the most side characters out of each of the 3 mangas, and they managed to flesh them out in a way that I felt was like perfect. The supporting characters in Harbor Descent don't feel like they're just there to be plot devices to move the story along. However, the same really can't be said for Songstress 5. The 4 sisters feel like they're really only there so that the events of the story are able to transpire. Which is a shame because conceptually, I feel like the sisters are like really cool characters, especially 2 who has a really cool backstory outside of the manga, but they just don't really ever do anything with the sisters, and it's a shame, it's really disappointing. Fatal Crimson, on the other hand, is a little bit different from the other 2 manga because you really only have one supporting character, and that's Neuro, which I will talk about more later. You have other semi-significant characters, but Neuro is really the only side character that persists throughout the entire story. Harbor Descent would initially release in 2022, with its first volume coming out in 2025, while the other 2 mangas ran between the years of 2013 and 2014, and were written by a completely different author. This is primarily because at the time, Yoko Taro felt like his writing would have been too chaotic for the construction of a cohesive narrative, which basically means that in a way, Songstress 5 and Fatal Crimson were like supervised fan fiction. And that's also probably why it felt a little disappointing at times. I'm sure there are several constraints and limitations into what new lore could have been created for these characters, or even the events that could have been covered. I think it's pretty clear that Yoko Taro has grown a lot as a storyteller since 2013, as we see with Harbor Descent, so I hope that we get to see more work like this in the future. One of the things that I've always found awesome in this whole Nier franchise was the Black Flower and the Red Eye Infection. I'm a huge sucker for disease-like calamities, such as zombie plagues, ceremorphosis, or even the corruption of the ruinous powers from Warhammer 40k. Things that act as infections and create chaos are among my favorite plot devices in fiction, so it's no surprise that I immediately fell in love with the concept of the Black Flower and the Red Eye Infection that can be seen throughout each of these stories. In Songstress 5, the Black Flower is the main disruptor of the story whose purpose is to spread destruction, and in Fatal Crimson, the Red Eye Infection is something that is born out of the power of the Black Flower, whose purpose is to infect and spread destruction. And then after the Red Eye Infection makes its way to the world of Nier, the machine lifeforms recreate their own version of the Red Eye Infection and call it the Logic Virus, after gaining access to all of human history. That's one of the things that I love about these stories. There's this consistent and overlooming threat that manages to influence every era, even if it takes different forms. In my opinion, the villains of the story are a bit less interesting than the actual events, at least for Songstress 5 and Fatal Crimson. Starting with Songstress 5, you have the Lords faction, which is basically Bass, Gray, Shaxor, Kurella, Partition, and Bardis. And then you have Zero as the archenemy. While each of these villains do play a significant role in the progression of the story, none of their motives are ever really fleshed out. You have the Lords, who seem to just want power, Bardis, who just wants to fight, and then you have Zero, who just wants to destroy all traces of the Black Flower. Moving on to Fatal Crimson, you have the only villain in the story that actually matters, and that's the Big Black Dragon. While he does appear throughout the story, it isn't really clear to the protagonist that he is the main villain behind everything. Now, I know I hinted at him not really being an interesting villain, but I do appreciate villains who are just evil for the sake of being evil, because that's basically what the Black Dragon is. He just wants to watch the world burn, and I do appreciate him for it. You do have Faye and Neuro's sister, who are semi-villains in the story, but Faye is a very minor character in the story, and Neuro's sister isn't ever even given a name. So I think it's fair to say that the only one who is a villain in Fatal Crimson is the Black Dragon. The machine lifeforms are probably the best villains out of all of these 3 stories, and that's because they actually feel like they have a purpose behind what they do. The machine lifeforms want to evolve and grow, and to that end, they will endlessly skirmish with the androids instead of completely annihilating them, which is the equivalent of farming infinite XP in Baldur's Gate 3 by killing the summons over and over again and that I think makes for really interesting villains. You can also consider the Council of Humanity to also be kind of like semi-villains, since they actively send out the androids into impossible situations just to stress test for the purpose of creating even stronger androids. But I would say that's more like the Council of Humanity are a flawed system rather than outright villains in the story. I know I touched upon this earlier before, but the way the sisters are written is just truly disappointing. The concept of the sisters basically being different aspects of Zero's personality / aspirations is awesome. I like it. It reminds me of how the homunculus from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood excised the 7 deadly sins from himself, and they take on a personality of their own. However, we don't really get to see the sisters go through their own growth or any meaningful character motivations. They kind of just follow one around and they do what she wants. The story makes it feel like they're only really there to die and open the seal to the Black Flower and showcase its power. I understand that the focus of the story may not have been the 4 sisters, and that fleshing them out could have been a different manga all on its own, but Harbor Descent is an example of handling a large cast of characters perfectly. Despite its short runtime of only 18 chapters, even Futaba and Yatsuba, the operators on the station, had bigger growth arcs than the 4 sisters throughout their entire manga. My favorite android even ended up being Daisy, despite only being a minor character in the story, who I think was done completely dirty at the end. It's not fair that she survived all of that just to be executed, but at least it felt like they had a presence in the story and played a role beyond just furthering the event. TLDR, the sisters just feel completely useless throughout the entire story, and that to me is really disappointing because I feel like they had so much potential as characters that's just never really realized. Well, I'm sure you can find a multitude of things that are just confusing or outright don't make sense if you comb over through each story. I picked my top 4 moments that I have a bone to pick with. Starting with Songstress 5, there's this sort of feeling that Gabriella doesn't seem to understand much about the Black Flower and what it is. When the Black Flower first breaks out of its seal, she almost seems just as confused as everyone else about what the Black Flower even is, which is odd for a creature who is supposedly the enemy of the Black Flower. And maybe Gabriella just forgot what the Black Flower was due to dying and then reincarnating, which is perfectly reasonable that Gabriella might not be the same dragon that first arrived when they were all pulled from wherever they came from. However, it doesn't really make sense why Gabriella wouldn't then be confused when Michael confronts her for siding with the Intoner sisters because of what they are. Instead, Gabriella just kind of tells Michael to go kick rocks, almost as if she understands the implications of what it means to side with the Intoner sisters. Now, there is already much mystery surrounding the dragons and the Black Flower, along with their origins. However, I would think that Gabriella should know more about the Black Flower than what it seems like she knows in the manga. It almost feels like they made her purposefully ignorant so it wouldn't conflict with Gabriella flying the sisters to Cathedral City to open the seal. Otherwise, why would Gabriella take the sisters to unseal something she knew was so evil and dangerous? Remaining in the same vein, at the start of the story, one is able to sense Partition spying on them through the sound of his heartbeat, in spite of him using magic to conceal his presence. However, when they're about to open the gate to the Black Flower, I don't know if one fails a quick time event or she rolls a nat 1, but she somehow manages not to detect an ambush. I also find it hard to believe that she would have been caught off guard if you were flying into a hostile area. I would imagine that you would be ready for any kind of ambush or attack, but who knows, maybe Gray just found that 1 in a million chance where the ambush actually does work. Moving over to Fatal Crimson, every time Brother One uses his power of song, the Black Dragon will beeline towards him with no exceptions. But at the end of the story, the Black Dragon reveals that Brother One is the source of the Red Eye infection, and that he will let him live so that Brother One can continue spreading it. But if that's the case, then why go out of your way to attack Brother One whenever he uses the power of song? I saw some people on Reddit saying that the dragon comes because it's an excuse to kill people, or that it's for the same reason that Michael attacks Zero when they first meet, or it's because dragons are the natural enemy of the flower. But to me, none of these really make any sense. Dragons don't need an excuse to kill people, they just kind of do it. I mean, who's gonna stop them? And while it's true that the dragons can sense the power of the flower, it doesn't mind control them into attacking, as we saw with One and Gabriella. The only explanation I've been able to come up with is that the Black Dragon comes not to kill Brother One, but to spread fear and destruction around Brother One for the purpose of spreading the red eye infection. During a flashback, we are kind of told that anxiety, tension, and turmoil can help rapidly spread the infection, so maybe that's why the Black Dragon shows up. But Brother One is going to spread the infection regardless, considering he's the source, and dragons are kind of immortal, so I find it hard to believe that the dragon is in any kind of rush. There is also this idea that Brother One's power is fake, which is peppered throughout the story, and it's never really explained. My best guess is that this is just a reference to the fact that even though Brother One and One are twins, it's more of an Adam and Eve situation where One created Brother One from a part of her, so technically he's kind of like a clone, but this is never really explained in the manga, so I'm not sure if that's the connection we're supposed to make, but I'm just gonna make that connection regardless, because it's the only one that makes sense to me. Otherwise, I have zero clue why they're calling him a fake. It's pretty clear that the writer of Fatal Crimson was going for a darker vibe, and while I usually don't really care much for evil and sadistic characters in fiction, the more I reflect on it, the more I think the way Nero was written was actually perfect for showcasing how dark and twisted the world had become. When you are forced to ally yourself with a murder and sexual abuser whose goals entirely contradict your own, I think it's safe to say that you're not in the good times. You're in the bad times. Although Nero is a easy character to hate, and I really do hate him. This guy sucks. As a person, Nero just kind of sucks. That being said, I do appreciate that he was made to be a completely irredeemable character and not just someone who pretends to be evil. As Zero and One are forced to team up against Bardis, Gabriella sacrifices her intelligence to become a mindless beast to access power to completely annihilate him, and I feel like this moment is supposed to be touching, but it comes off as completely undeserved. Throughout the manga, we don't really see any interactions between One and Gabriella that indicate that these two are 100% ride or die. Like, how many people are willing to effectively give up their life for someone that they met like literally 2 months ago, especially a dragon whose intelligence is their strongest point of pride? And I suppose that's really one of my reoccurring gripes with this manga, Songstress 5. It feels like things are constantly done just for the plot. Like Gabriella sacrifices her pride as a dragon just to stop Bardis, so One could then merge her soul with Gabriella to continue the plot. While Fatal Crimson doesn't have the same feeling that some things are undeserved, there is one moment that I did end up feeling like was a little silly. At the end, after Brother One finds out that he is the origin of the red eye infection, he is so devastated that he asks Nero to end his life. But the way that he says it, it almost feels like Brother One believed Nero to be a good guy deep down inside, and when it's all said and done, Nero would have ended Brother One's life, putting an end to the corrupted power that he carries. But of course Nero doesn't do that because he's an asshole, and now Nero just carries around Brother One's chopped head so he can continue spreading the infection and bringing death and destruction. Now perhaps this just goes to show how naive Brother One was, because how could you ever think that the guy who wants to watch the world burn would willingly help you on your mission to protect the world from the red eye infection if he didn't have any ulterior motives? Everything wrong with Songstress 5 is handled perfectly by Yoko Taro. You have a similar thing where two groups of people who just met need to sacrifice and need to be willing to lay down their lives for each other. On the side of the androids, this wouldn't be too difficult. They are here for a singular mission and are prepared to lay down their lives to finish it. However, the same thing can't be said for the Resistance. Not only have they completely defected, but each of them left on not so friendly terms. But we see how this issue of trust is alleviated when the androids save one of the Resistance members from the logic virus, thereby earning their trust. However, trust isn't enough to willingly lay down your life for someone on their mission, which is why we see how each of the members of the Resistance lives every single day with the knowledge that death is right around the corner. For them, it's not about if, it's about when. So if there's a chance at a potential peaceful life, free from the constant fighting, hiding, and running, it makes perfect sense that the Resistance would team up with the Yorha androids and even be willing to sacrifice and lay down their lives so the rest can keep going. And that's what I love about Pearl Harbor Descent. Everyone's actions make sense, and everyone's motives were perfectly laid out. The story felt consistent, and the moments that were supposed to be impactful felt completely deserved. Now, I didn't really find much criticism online. However, I did find one piece of criticism that I felt was important to touch on, and it was this idea that the abuse in Fatal Crimson was absurd. And while I understand that there was definitely some brutal scenes, I don't think that they were there solely for shock factor. I think that they said something important about the setting, and in a familiar fashion to how people joke about The Boys being a modern day documentary on US politics, every scene with abuse in Fatal Crimson maps perfectly to things that happen commonly in the real world. Yes, it can be uncomfortable to read about, but the real world is uncomfortable, and I don't think it's fair to dismiss the scenes by calling them absurd because they were uncomfortable. It tends to be the case that when people get too much power, they tend to get up to some pretty messed up things. Throughout history, when armies captured villages, they didn't just plant a flag down. These soldiers would get up to some pretty messed up things. To this day, we still see incidents where US soldiers stationed overseas essay locals. It's unfortunate, but the instances of abuse illustrated in Fatal Crimson aren't beyond the pale. In conclusion, while Songstress 5 and Fatal Crimson had their flaws that held them back, especially their reliance on readers being acquainted with the lore, I do think that they are a decent read if you are a fan of Yoko Taro and the world he has created. Overall, as a collective, I would give them a solid 7 out of 10.